Okay, so we're now going to move on to our final speaker in this session, and this is Heiko Balzter. Thank you. So Heiko is a professor of physical geography at the University of Leicester, but he's also, as many of you will know, the chair of the programme coordination team of the UKRI Landscape Decisions Programme. And Heiko, welcome. You're going to talk to us about building back better landscapes, UK landscape decision making after COVID-19. So hopefully this will flow on lovely after all of the previous presentations. And please, Heiko, over to you.
Thank you. I'm Heiko Balzter and I work at the University of Leicester, and I'm also chairing the program coordination team of the Landscape Decisions UKRI program. And I just want to talk about building back better landscapes, because we've been thinking a lot in the program together with the PIs of the 52 or so projects in the program and with the other members of the program coordination team about what the options might be of coming out of the COVID-19 situation in the UK and how we can actually rebuild better conditions than there were before. So hopefully you will find there's some food for thought in there. The UKRI Landscape Decisions Programme, first of all, for those who don't know it, I think there are probably very few people here, but there may be some who haven't been looking at this before. It is funded by the UKRI Strategic Priorities Fund, and it has three main work packages. One is the Developing New Mathematics, where this I&I initiative sits, and that has a number of other projects in it as well, including advances on valuing natural capital and some smaller and large maths grants. We have work package 2 on building new model solutions with the Assist AgLand project and the Valuing Nature Partnership, Demystifying Models report activity, and then one on stimulating new thinking on landscapes and communities. And that includes things like Sacred Landscapes, a project in Wales, landscape and heritage research networking projects, and follow-on funding projects. So what are the challenges to landscape decisions from COVID-19? On this slide, what you see there is the California wildfires. What looks like a nuclear detonation actually is the wildfires in California. And this particular smoke cloud that you see there is forming when the fires are particularly intense. So they give off a lot of heat, and that actually changes the atmospheric dynamics of the smoke plume. I think we have seen this in Siberia this year. We are seeing it currently in the Amazon in Brazil. We're seeing it in California. The climate is completely going bonkers. And we see extreme events all over the world. And people respond to that. So the photo there in the middle is the Extinction Rebellion protest that happened recently. I think people are growing impatient. More and more people are growing really impatient with the lack of a coordinated response globally to this climate crisis and the associated species extinction that is happening currently around the world. So there are social processes coming in that we need to also understand in the context of climate change and how we need to respond to climate change and the challenges it poses. And of course, with the lockdown, that also had some implications in relation to this, where this is the streets of London during the lockdown, where, empty streets, where previously there were loads of people in the streets. And that had some impacts on the climate that are measurable and can be observed in the atmospheric chemistry, like the reduced greenhouse gas emissions during the lockdown when the economic activity declined. But what were the environmental impacts of the lockdown, actually? I don't think we fully understand them yet. First of all, we are not fully out of the global lockdown, but we are slowly coming out of it in many parts of the world. And it's a very dynamic situation at the moment. I think, we all probably have our eyes on the news every day and seeing which countries are added to quarantine lists and which ones are taken off and these kind of things, and local lockdown areas in the UK. Very dynamic. And I think it'll stay like that for at least the foreseeable future. So the restrictions on movement and social distancing actually led to some reduced visitor numbers to some of our national parks, for example, and some of our green spaces. But do we know what the impacts of that were? We only know it really anecdotally, as far as I'm aware. Some of the local public footpaths were very, very heavily used because people were allowed to go out for daily exercise in the local environment, but they were not necessarily allowed to travel elsewhere. So some other footpaths were probably overgrown by vegetation in that time. And we've seen this in the vicinity where I live, you know, where some of the more distant places where not many people were walking, actually the hedges were sort of encroaching on the footpaths. So we don't actually know quite how the countryside had changed as part of the lockdown. Conservation areas, some of them were left unmanaged for a couple of weeks or months, you know, when actually it was not possible to undertake some of the work, and only for key workers. And again, you know, that may have led to wildlife flourishing in some places. We know anecdotally from the National Trust that they were saying, well, wildlife is now sort of colonizing car parks and things like this, you know, and animals are coming closer to places where previously there was a lot of traffic by people. And the range of wildlife may have been extended. Now, of course, that may be reversing again, but again, that has not really been observed, partly because many of the ecological surveys were on pause during the lockdown. So there's also a paucity of data. And I think, generally speaking, there's a big challenge how such big changes can be modeled mathematically. So since this is an Isaac Newton workshop, I just want to stimulate your thinking processes about how we can possibly prepare our models for really big earth-shattering events like a pandemic and all the policy changes that are coming with it. We create our models normally to be valid in a certain parameter space and within certain conditions. Now, what happens if those conditions change very fundamentally? I think we don't really understand for all of the models that we have produced, and I think it would be really interesting to give some thought to whether we can actually model the processes during lockdown and how the ecosystem services and the natural capital have changed as a consequence of all these changes in what people do and how people do it actually work. So are our models and tools adequate for this? Are they still valid under those changed conditions? And the photo you see there is Dovedale in the Peak District. Some of you may know this area. It's a beautiful spot. But of course, that also was very overcrowded as soon as the lockdown was eased again. You know, many people actually longed for the countryside and they wanted to get out. So there was also an unmet need by many people for landscapes. And we actually have a better understanding now, as Sue was saying in her talk, you know, that actually people are craving to be outdoors and people are craving access to the countryside. So I think that raises interesting questions about, you know, if people feel the compulsion to go to the national parks, of which there are only a limited number, then, you know, why do people not use the local environment more to get the daily exercise and to get out and about? It may not be as attractive as they were hoping for, or they may just not enjoy it so much, you know, and it may be just a case of thinking ahead how we can make local recreation areas more attractive to people. Now, the climate crisis clearly, with the current extreme climate in this year, you know, has posed the question, how soon can we actually reach net zero carbon? And there's a big debate around, you know, is 2030 or 2050 appropriate? Do we need to do it even earlier? You know, and I think the answer depends partly on whether you're a politician or whether you're a climate scientist or whether you are pragmatic or whether you are really deeply worried about the whole thing or not. But one thing is clear, climate change has moved on to become a race against the clock. I think it's no longer a discussion around, you know, do we believe in the science or not? There are still climate deniers on this planet, unfortunately, and some of them have a lot of influence currently. But having said that, I think it is clear in the scientific community, at least, that we are now facing a race against the clock in terms of how severe the impacts of climate change will become and how the suffering from that will actually hit different people in different parts of the world. So the map you see here is actually in April 2020, the rainfall anomaly from the Met Office data in the UK, and you can see quite how severe the drought was, particularly in Northern England. So there was actually a lot of rainfall deficit in those areas, and that has implications on crop yield. It has implications on food security in the longer term. If we're getting more of these extreme weather events as part of climate change, and we are tearing up international trade agreements and relying more on British produced food, then of course we are more vulnerable to the impacts of extreme weather coming from climate change. So everything is connected, and that makes it rather hard to simulate it. And importantly, in the program context, what is the role of landscapes in responding to the climate emergency and to mitigate climate change? Is it all about planting trees and preserving peatlands? You know, is that sufficient, or do we also need to think about other things? Do we need to think about agricultural production systems? Do we need to look at landscapes as interconnected elements in the whole system? You know, that do not just look at one segment of agriculture, another one of tree planting, and a third one of peatland conservation. Do we need to look at all these elements as interlinked components of an emerging organism of a landscape, if you like, a living, breathing organism? That basically means people get a whole basket of ecosystem services, and we need to look at all the ecosystem services coming from all the components in the landscape. The positive thing about the lockdown, of course, was that greenhouse gas emissions went down. And the question is actually, can we keep greenhouse gas emissions down, or at least lower than they were before? We are currently in a recession. That's not a good thing for economists and for the people who are affected by the impacts of the recession, of course. But having said that, coming out of the recession offers also an opportunity to build back other parts of the economies, to strengthen more environmentally friendly parts of the economy than we previously had. And it doesn't necessarily have to go back to where we were before. So the question here I want to pose is, how can landscapes support the economic green recovery, if you want to call it that? You know, is there some merit in actually thinking about Britain becoming a world leader in certain environmental technologies and environmentally friendly production systems? But another aspect, unfortunately, is being prepared for a second wave of the virus. You know, we are still in a global pandemic. And what role do landscapes play in mitigating the negative impacts of local lockdowns and restrictions on mental and physical health? One thing that is clear is there is the risk of people who suffer from obesity, particularly, to the impacts of COVID-19 infection, and people have a higher mortality rate if they are obese or if they are of old age. So therefore, I think we need to look very hard at the opportunities that people have to keep fit, and to also look after their mental health by having access to landscapes in their local vicinity if they cannot travel. So there's a bit of a responsibility here, I think, to think ahead and think about those aspects for public health. How can we harness the power of landscapes to reduce infection rates by allowing social distancing, you know, avoiding the Dovedale situation where everybody goes to the same beauty spot? How do we use landscapes to actually reduce personal risk from the virus and the mortality rates from the virus by keeping people healthier? And that raises the interesting question, actually, about the landscape decisions and land ownership. And quite often, many of the ecosystem services, like the positive impacts on mental and physical health of being outdoors, is a public good that people are benefiting from. But the land they use for this purpose quite often belongs to private landowners or to organizations who actually take the decisions how that land is being used within the framework set by policy. So this public health aspect of landscapes, I think, is not really fully understood, I think, at the moment. And we need to look at this and also think about how we can make local landscapes more attractive to people in the interest of public health. Now, an interesting aspect I came across in the context of this actually came from a blog by Annette Mikes from the Said Business School in Oxford. And this was about evolving cultural values and perceptions of the pandemic. And I think I would be very, very interested in having some discussions with social scientists, of which I'm not one, to think about how these cultural tribes, after John Adams, for example, could be used as a concept to explain how people have coped with the lockdowns and how people are viewing the value of landscapes before and during and after the lockdown. Different people worry about different risks, like the recession, public and mental health, about war, pollution, unemployment, or whatever it is. And we need to understand actually what people are worried about and what their thinking processes are. You know, and this is the concept of so-called cultural tribes. And the social scientist John Adams identified these 4 different cultural tribes, which are called individualists, egalitarians, interventionists, and fatalists. And it's a really interesting concept where the individualists think about nature as being benign and predictable and forgiving to humans, that includes things like the spread of a virus and diseases and so on. And our economies, on the other hand, in their view of the world, are fragile and require protection from intervention. The preferred management style is laissez-faire. The concept of herd immunity came out of this kind of thinking. That was a clearly individualist kind of cultural tribal concept. That was the very early thinking in the UK and was also the thinking in the US in large parts. But as it became clear that this would be coming with a very high death toll, the thinking moved on a little bit and went more to the egalitarian sort of debate. Egalitarians think about nature as being fragile and unforgiving. The economy is robust enough to allow the precautionary principle. So we need to somehow protect the public from harm, and therefore there's a degree of intervention required. And egalitarian values mean actually that several countries switched to a rescue at all cost mode, and we saw this in the clap for the NHS activity and things like this. And all of a sudden, nothing else mattered but keeping the death toll down and keeping infection rates down after, first of all, the herd immunity concept was the preferred option. And then the interventionists are like a combination. They have some elements of the individualists and egalitarians, and within limits, they believe nature behaves predictably. The nature of the response is actually interventionist, so they believe one has to intervene in the economy and in the natural processes like in a pandemic. They rely on cost-benefit analysis as far as possible, and sort of are a mixture of the individualist values and the egalitarian values. And then the fatalists believe nature is completely beyond human control and that we are hostage to the outcomes of policy changes we cannot influence. And it's a major policy challenge, I suppose, to overcome the apathy and passivity of that group and engaging people who are a bit fatalist by their cultural background with the current policy debates and involving them in landscape decision-making processes more explicitly. That is maybe the biggest challenge of all these cultural tribes, how do we deal with the sort of fatalist communities that have disengaged from the process almost altogether? And just to stimulate the discussion that will follow, I just want to give you 3 things that I think we can do as a landscape decisions community. The first of which being, we can estimate the positive and negative impacts of the pandemic on ecosystem services and natural capital. I think we need to really understand, first of all, how the lockdown and the responses of policymakers here in the UK have influenced the ecosystem services and the natural capital, and we may discover some surprising features of this. We may discover some unexpected positive impacts or negative impacts of the policy decisions that were driven by the pandemic, but actually have impacts on landscapes. The second one is we need to develop clever models that use a cultural tribe approach or something similar to simulate changing values of people. We all notice this in our environments probably, the values of people around us have evolved a lot since the lockdown started. And we need to understand actually how they change. And we need to integrate that into the models and into the decision-making around landscapes and how we evolve future landscapes at in the next phase, after the end of the CAP, after Brexit on the 31st of December, and with a view on the other challenges we are facing. And the final point is really, we need to provide some scientific evidence to make the case, not to only build back better, but to build back greener. And what I mean by that actually is that the scientific evidence is needed for DEFRA, for the devolved administrations, and for the other agencies and stakeholders to make it clear that actually there are some impacts on ecosystem services and on public health that are not often accounted for when making decisions about some other features of the economic recovery. And we need to somehow make sure that the scientific evidence is being considered in the policy process. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and move on to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Heiko. You raised lots of interesting questions there. So, and again, lots for us to discuss tomorrow as we start to understand more about how social sciences can integrate with all the other disciplines we've been discussing in previous programs. And again, well, I'll just try and sneak a couple of questions in before we call the session to the end. And there is one from Sue, actually, which is related to your introduction to the cultural tribes theory. And she asks, how does cultural tribes framing account for power, interests, influence, and risks and benefits?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that. I can't, because I'm not a social scientist. But it would be very interesting. I was thinking actually when Sue gave her talk, I was thinking about, oh, that really links to that cultural tribe concept, you know, and it would be really nice to think about how one can link these things together, you know, because actually it's about how much people feel engaged in the process, you know, like the fatalist disengaging from anything. And that relates also to benefits and risks, you know, and public health benefits of landscapes that I mentioned, for example, are one of the aspects, I guess, you know, where you could also say, you know, who owns what in the landscape, you know, which landscape elements belong to whom and who takes decisions about what and who benefits from what, you know, because it's also, we need to recognize there are some public benefits coming from privately owned features in the landscape.
Thank you. And yeah, I suspect we will touch on this issue as well as we go through all of the presentations tomorrow, as well as in the breakout groups on Thursday. Just one other question, I guess, which relates to some really interesting ideas there around how current experiences during lockdown and during the coronavirus crisis can influence landscapes and landscape decision making. Do you have any feedback for participants on how those can be incorporated or not into ongoing projects or future projects in the Landscape Decisions Programme?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, we had a series of workshop type meetings recently in the program, so we have had lots of discussions around various questions relating to this and other aspects, and it is very clear that many of the projects actually have felt the impacts of the pandemic on their planned stakeholder contacts and planned meetings, which did not happen, you know, and had to be online. And of course, that means you lose some of the potential participants who are not very comfortable engaging with meetings like this online. So there are clear impacts on this. I think projects are responding to this to different degrees, you know, but I think people are very aware in the program that this is changing quite a lot, and it raises completely new questions sometimes around what people set out to find out, you know, and all of a sudden something big changes, then all your assumptions change, and you have to think again about actually how can we make sense of all this on top of what we previously set out to study. So the individual projects that I've spoken to are very aware of these things, you know, and I think there's a process of aligning the research activities to the evolving drivers, if you like, of landscape change and landscape decision change.
Okay. Thank you very much, Heiko. So there are more questions arriving on Slido, but I'm aware of time, so I'm at this point going to say that we will save all of those questions and make sure that they do go into our breakout group discussions on Thursday. But I would just like to again now thank all of our speakers. We've had some really great insights on sort of the needs and the issues that we need to be taking into account when we're thinking about landscapes. And we will hear more in this afternoon's sessions from some of the projects that have been funded already under the UKRI Landscape Decision Programme, and that session will start at 1:30. So hopefully we will see many of you back at that point in time to hear more about some of the ongoing research in this area. But thank you very much and have a nice lunchtime.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.